Welcome to The Big Picture. I'm Phil Arno. When my dad was a young college student, this was back in the days of the Depression, he worked his way through college by unloading freight cars in South Buffalo. Being the first one of his family to be born in this country, he didn't, as a college kid working his way through with all these dock workers and freight car loaders, he didn't fit into that crowd all that great. And I can remember him telling me that it led to more than one fist fight. And he got bullied quite a bit. Things that you wouldn't think are acceptable in today's society. But COVID, political divisions, inflation, and a lot of the stress that hits you every day takes a toll on people. Workplace violence is something that we're going to talk about in this show. And with me to talk about that are Denny Thomas and Kim Leiker. And they are with Discovery Investigative Services. And you basically specialize in helping businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, deal with problems within their workforce where employees just don't get along. Tell me a little bit about how prevalent that is in today's, workplace.
Yeah, Phil, it's in every industry. Workplace violence has been an issue for years. I think COVID, a lot of it has kind of moved it to the forefront of society now. It's a combination of a lot of things that are contributing to it. The biggest thing is small, medium-sized businesses are just not prepared to deal with some of the issues that are being brought into their workforce now.
Well, individuals, from different backgrounds and, undergoing different kinds of stress. And as I said in my introduction, it goes back all the way to when my dad was a youngster, and this was back in the Depression. It's human nature to have things get on your nerves. And when you're working with somebody, strangers or people that you work with that you don't know all that well or whatever, it can erupt into hard feelings and bullying and violence. And we hear about this in the news every once in a while where it gets to the extreme. And that's what you guys are trying to cut off at the pass, right?
Correct. It's all about, what we're doing, Kim is in private practice as a mental health counselor. I'm the president of Discovery Investigative Services, and our worlds kept colliding. I'd go to Kim with advice, Kim would come to me with advice, and the whole point of this training that we're putting together for businesses is to prevent it in its infancy, to remediate it before it gets to that point. And one of the things that we've both identified over the years is the behavior moves on a continuum. It starts at bullying, then it becomes threatening and intimidated behavior, then maybe it's a push or a shove, and then an aggravated assault. And if it isn't remediated in one of those earliest stages, that's when you run into the workplace violence, the active shooter, the disgruntled employee who comes in and hurts several people. We're trying to stop that from happening.
So you counsel businesses ahead of time just to deal with employees in general and how employees can come into conflict with each other?
Correct.
Okay. And
correct.
How much of your business is actually dealing with incidents that have happened? And Kim, maybe you can get involved with how much you talk to people in the workplace that have had conflict and are now either being disciplined by their employer or they're facing some kind of situation where they have to behave differently. They have to modify what they're doing. How does that work?
Well, I get to see both sides of it. I get to hear from the victim. I get to hear from the person who is doing the offending, and I get to hear their backstory of how it went down. So I get to see it from both ends, like why they are the way they are and why they acted the way that they did. And then being in a business, I get to see the outcome of the story that unfolded that I get to hear.
Well, when you talk to people, is there a pattern that is fairly common, or are all the situations different?
The pattern that I observe is people recreate versions of their past in any environment or relationship that they're in. They repeat their history like a cyclical kind of fashion. So if they were in a bullying situation growing up, in a work environment or a relationship, there's going to be some kind of criticizing, some kind of repeat of bullying.
And is this something where it goes, typically, it goes two ways, or is it usually somebody who's picking on somebody who doesn't really want to be involved with an interaction?
What I see is that it goes both ways, because you get to a certain point where you stop wanting to take the bullying, and then you want to become the aggressor, because you get to that enough point where you're tired of suffering and being treated a certain way.
And this goes on in small businesses and large businesses. It really doesn't matter what size. I mean, if you have employees and they work together side by side, there's always the potential for conflict. How does an employer, first of all, recognize the potential for that? And how do you counsel employers to deal with it up front before it erupts?
I'll tell you, Phil, it's all policy. It's policy and procedures. And a lot of the companies that we deal with, they're small landscaping firms. Might be a pizzeria, might be a mechanic shop where they've got, 25, 30 employees, but they don't have an HR function. Or, I've worked for big companies my entire career where I'm a part of a team of, anywhere from 3 to 10 people. And these little companies don't have that. So one of the things that we're doing is helping them create those policies. What's acceptable behavior in the workplace? And make sure that if an employee is crossing that line, that there is a progressive discipline. A lot of these active shooters and really bad workplace incidents that happen throughout the U.S., there's a ton of warning signs that are there in advance of those acts. And what we're doing is we're trying to teach these small and medium-sized businesses how to identify what those warning signs are, in addition to crafting a policy that you can then act upon.
When they craft a policy, or when they come into the decision-making process as to how they're going to deal with something that already exists or potential, how often or what role does the National Labor Relations Board or other government agencies, do they get involved at all in the process, or is it only afterwards?
No, it's typically afterwards. I mean, OSHA will get involved if there was an accident, if there was some negligence, but it's always after the fact. Most shops, most businesses in the U.S. are non-union. The big union shops have a team of investigators and security people and HR people. That's not the group that we're helping. We're targeting the small, again, that small to medium-sized business who probably doesn't even know those resources exist to start with. But pre-incident, they wouldn't get involved.
And as we said before, COVID and all the division, and that's being spread, whether it's race, whether it's economics, whether it's political, there's a lot of friction in today's society. Have you found that especially since COVID, has it increased a lot, or is it just slowly increased a little bit, or is it pretty consistent?
No, I think it's increased a lot. I mean, if you think about it, businesses are a microcosm of society. Look what's going on in society. And really, this is a question probably Kim can answer better than I could. What she sees on the mental health piece. But I think there's absolutely been an increase post-COVID or through that COVID area. What do you think?
Another question, though, is when you talk to people who have been in conflict, and there's either an instigator and somebody who's reacting or whatever, how do you deal with that? You, as a mental health expert, you come in, you're not expecting the firm to be prepared to counsel people. Is it kind of a threat of disciplinary action unless there's change, or do you try and take a more intuitive course where you're addressing the problems that created it, and you want to counsel people to be better people in general, for lack of a better way to put it?
More of the second one. I help people kind of interpret it and see it differently. Like, they might see it as conflict, but what are the underlying factors and influences that created that conflict? So is there like past trauma? Is there a past history within that person, within the workplace? What are the factors that led into the conflict? And hear it from both sides.
You know, when things happen, when incidents happen like this, I know, take road rage, for example. You know, two people are driving cars, and it's very impersonal because you're not angry at a person so much as you're angry at that vehicle that cut you off, or that vehicle is going too slow, or did something wrong. And there's a release of emotion. People do things that they wouldn't normally do if they're standing in line next to somebody, you know, at a show or whatever, because that's personal. But after this release of conflict, there's almost like I think for most reasonable people, there's a release there and a regret where they back off, and, you know, they self-analyze, you know, am I really like that? Should I be doing this? Do you find that, or are people more hardcore where they just are not going to drop it? They just really have this grudge and they won't let go?
For me, it's more under the surface. It's not about the vehicle that cut them off. It's about a lifetime of experiences where people got in front of them, where they were powerless, where they didn't have control over that situation. Every time then they're there in that vehicle and somebody cuts them off and it's unexpected, they get into that reactive survivor mode. And then everything they felt in the past comes into the now. And if they were once silent, they're going to project aggression and get that rage out as a way to protect themselves.
Well, we're out of time for this segment. When we talk again in the next segment, I want to talk about what kind of businesses, large, small, medium, you know, how it differs. And again, how we counsel people and try to avoid these things. But we'll be back right after this. Stay tuned. Welcome back. We're talking about conflict in the workplace and possibly workplace violence. With me are Dennis Thomas and Kim Leiker, and they're with Discovery Investigative Service. And you deal with this all the time. You know, people who are watching may say, gee, I didn't think it was that common. And we hear about it every once in a while when it gets really out of hand. But we didn't think that, you know, it's a big problem in society today. But most workplaces, unless it's an exception, there's pressure, and that leads to things. I mean, how is it? Does it differ from a small business to a medium-sized business to a large business, or is it really the same across the board?
Well, I mean, what I see, there's a core. It doesn't matter the environment, small, medium, large. People like recreate, again, things from their past. So if they're feeling criticized, devalued, unappreciative, they're going to respond a certain way. And how that work environment intervenes is going to be no different than the singular one person in front of them that responded to them in the same way.
Right, and from a business perspective, Phil, it really comes down to leadership. And it doesn't matter if you're a small business or if you don't have a strong leader, you're going to run into issues. And if you're not going to remediate those issues, or you don't have the wherewithal, you don't have the leadership skills to address it, it's going to escalate.
How much of your business is counseling businesses when there is no conflict and just preparing them to avoid it, and how much is when something has occurred and you have to come in and kind of clean up a mess?
I mean, I'll speak on my side. I mean, right now, everything I do is reactive. And I can't speak to Kim, but that's why we started this collaboration, was to really get out in front of it and get out in front of businesses and help them. Because I'll tell you, at the end of the day, businesses don't want to lose their employees. The labor market is tough enough now to find good help, to find qualified applicants. They don't want to terminate their employees because there's a cost to doing that. You got to rehire them, you got to recruit new applicants. So ideally, if we can get out in front of these businesses and help them remediate and identify these issues up front, it'll also make them more profitable as well. So,
well, most commonly, if they don't have an HR department in small or medium business, and you go into kind of pre-train, when nothing is actually erupted, is it, and I think we've mentioned this before, is it just policy that you counsel each individual company to come up with for their particular workplace, or is it also technique on communicating with employees, or is it a combination of both?
I see it as a combination of both policy, and then you got to know that the people that are there working for you, like what they need, an understanding of where they came from.
Is that easier with small businesses because it's more of an intimate relationship with employees?
It is. It's easier to affect change in a smaller business
Absolutely.
than in a big corporation, because there's a lot of things that need to be changed along the way with the bigger one.
What's the average size business that you deal with, if there is? I mean, in terms of how many employees they have.
For me, the average business is probably anywhere between 750 and 1,500 employees.
So that's a relatively large company. And what about companies that have 50 or 100 employees or 75 employees? Do you get into those much?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty. I mean, when you look across the realm, it's pretty even, Steven. I deal with a lot of construction companies, small law firms. Again, and you're going to have there's conflict there too. But it's really across the board.
Once an issue has arisen, and you're called in, after there's been a conflict, how typically do employees react when they're confronted with this, or there's a possible discipline, or you're trying to counsel them? Is there a defiance there, or are they humble, or how, typically, if there is a case, how do people react?
In a variety of ways they'll react. Like, some will be like humbled and feel that remorse. Some will still be in that fight, flight, freeze mode and want to continue to be reactive. So it's all about de-escalating them, getting them to a place of calm so you can have that conversation of what led to the conflict.
And I think a lot of employees feel they're not heard. Mm-hmm. So it's, to Kim's point, it's given them that avenue to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Is this something that the typical employer, and again, I'm thinking about companies that have 100 employees or 75 or whatever, they're not really in business to deal with these kinds of things. And when they're faced with that, how difficult is it to get owners or managers of these companies to be thinking along these lines when you set out rules and strategy to deal with this stuff? There's so many things that a manager has on his mind. I'm sure their favorite thing is not dealing with another problem.
Right.
So part of what you do is dealing with the workers, but the important part is dealing with the employers. How difficult is that?
For me, it's not. I mean, typically they're calling me because there's an issue, and we're able to provide a viable solution for them. Keep in mind, you've got this environment of workplace violence, bullying, intimidation. it's affecting everyone's productivity in that organization. So the minute we can go in and kind of remediate that behavior or address it or correct it, now everybody can get back to work. There's so many distractions, and if we're getting law enforcement involved, now I'm there, the police are there, Kim's working on something. It's distracting to the organization. So they're pretty receptive when you go in and you're dealing with those kind of sensitive investigations.
What's the worst kind of cases that you've dealt with? Is it actually been a result of injuries having happened and people getting into that kind of a conflict where somebody really had to go to the hospital or whatever?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the last couple of years, employee-on-employee assaults have increased about 40%. So where it was threatening behavior, it's escalated now. It's moved up that continuum where employees are punching each other or they're pulling knives on each other. And this is in, who wants to deal with that in a business, right? You've got, to your point, 20 tasks that you want to get done. You've got deadlines, and now you're dealing with this. So I think they're receptive for the most part. Again, who wants to work in that environment too, right? So the quicker they can resolve it, and Kim really gets in and is the driver behind what's driving all that behavior. We can react to things, but if you want to get to the core of it, that's where our collaboration has really been beneficial.
And Kim, when you are talking to individuals who are involved in some kind of a conflict, do you find that, as you implied before, they're bringing their personal life into it, past things that have happened to them, and they're reacting in ways that kind of are a carryover from not just that employee that they're in conflict with, but other things that have happened with them? Do you find that the type of people that you're dealing with would be not just in the workplace having problems, but out in a supermarket, standing in line or whatever? Are they problematic no matter where they are, or is it just because they're in the workplace and they're constantly with this other person?
You're going to see it in different areas. You'll see it in the grocery store. You'll see it in the road rage. They're kind of unraveling in a lot of different areas. It's a lot of misplaced emotion from the past, a lot of projecting of emotion. You know what I mean? If there's a pressure cooker and it needs to come out, it's going to start to overflow in other areas.
What kind of success rate, if you can call it that, do you have when it comes to people who have been in conflict and then not repeating and everything kind of being status quo going forward? Do you get feedback from the companies as to how things are progressing once you've been called in?
I do. For the most part, at this point in what I do, once I get called in, it's probably resulting in a termination or it's resulting in a prosecution. So the person isn't going to be involved in the organization anymore. I can tell you that what we're trying to do is help businesses identify red flags so that it doesn't have to come to that. We're getting called in. This has been progressing for weeks, months, years, and has never been addressed. And now we're addressing it. What we're trying to do is tell businesses there's a better way to do it. If you could address this at the 2-week mark, we wouldn't find ourselves in this current position.
Well, we've only got about a minute left in the show, so how would somebody who has a business get in touch with you?
I've got a website. It's www.discoveryinvestigativeservice.svc.com.
And who should be considering this? What kind of employer, if he's sitting there thinking, well, you know what, I've got a relatively small staff, maybe 20 or 30 people, and everybody seems to be getting along. Do I need to get somebody in to just in case and plan for this, or who should be reaching out?
I would say, every business, every segment, there's value in what we're bringing them.
I mean, what persists, continues to happen.
Right.
So you can avoid it for as long as you want to avoid it, but it's only going to grow bigger.
And I do want to add one thing though, Phil, because it's important. If a business is on notice that there's an employee conflict and there's bad behavior going on in the workplace and somebody gets seriously hurt, that business has a liability, a financial liability to the employee, the victim employee who gets hurt. So, I mean, there's value in prevention.
Well, if you're a business owner, if you're an employee and you've had any conflict or if you're undergoing any kind of bullying, these are the kinds of things that you should be aware of. And Discovery Investigative Services, someplace that you might want to reach out to. I want to thank Dennis Thomas and Kim Leiker for being my guests. That's it on this big picture, but we hope you found it interesting and informative. Thanks for watching The Big Picture. Thanks for watching WBBZ-TV. We enjoy bringing you information. We're your local station. So we'll see you next time on The Big Picture.